So in this lecture, we're going to cover a mental model, a way of thinking and reasoning about what's happening in this migration process, in this Angular NG upgrade, this official Angular migration process. But before we dig too deeply into this, I'm just going to cover some basic terminology just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I say the word Angular, I mean modern Angular, which at the time of recording is Angular 5. And when I say AngularJS, I mean the older version of Angular, the version 1.x lineage of Angular. That's what we now call AngularJS. So AngularJS is Angular 1, Angular is Angular 2+. Also in AngularJS, we have this concept of filters, and in Angular, they are now called pipes. What used to be controllers in AngularJS, we now create as components in Angular. And the directives, which used to have some template code in AngularJS, we now again call components in Angular. And the directives which didn't have any HTML, which were behavioral directives in AngularJS, we now just call directives in Angular. And what we call services and factories in AngularJS, we now only have services in Angular. And when I mention the word entity, I mean either a component, a service, a filter, a pipe, a controller, a single thing in the application. That's what I mean when I say entity. Now I'm going to be showing you a lot of slides through this course with entities that are either AngularJS or others that are in Angular. But the colors for both those logos are just kind of both red. And to help people with color blindness, where I can, I've changed Angular to be blue and AngularJS to be red. So if you see blue, it's modern Angular. If you see red, it's legacy AngularJS. So the first mental model, the first concept we need to get our head around in the migration strategy is that of dual booting. So this is a simplified view of the application that we're going to be migrating. And these are all the different entities in our application. We've got some components and controllers and services and resources and various things going on in our application. Now, when we're migrating, what we're doing is we're running both Angular 1 and modern Angular, and we're running both AngularJS and Angular in the same application at the same time. And we call this a hybrid application. So yes, during the process of migration, your users will have to download both the AngularJS framework and the new Angular framework. That's just the price you'll have to pay for using this upgrade approach. But the advantage of this upgrade approach, the advantage of having a hybrid application, is that then we can have different entities written in AngularJS and other entities written in Angular all working together in an application. So in this example, we've got the edit component and a service. They're written in Angular. The rest of the stuff is still written in AngularJS, and they're actually all running the same, or all working together to run the same application. And a really interesting fact about hybrid mode, about running applications in hybrid mode, is that in Angular, in modern Angular, we have something called zones. And because we've got something called zones, even in our legacy AngularJS application, we don't need to use scope.apply anymore. That's one of the advantages of zones in Angular. So in modern Angular, there is no equivalent of scope.apply. It's all handled automatically by zones. You can switch it off if you want, and you can have no zones run in Angular where you're forced to run scope.apply, or you can keep it as it is and just have Angular handle it all for you. So the second thing to understand, or the second concept, or the second mental model is interoperability. So we have an entity that's written in AngularJS and another entity that's written in Angular. Now I did say before that they can both kind of work together in the same application. But it doesn't work directly together. What we need to do is we need to do something called upgrading and downgrading. So we can take an AngularJS entity and upgrade it to an upgraded AngularJS entity. And we can also take an Angular entity and downgrade it into a downgraded Angular entity. And then we can do things like our upgraded AngularJS entity can then work with our Angular component. And it can actually also still work with other AngularJS components or entities, and even work with other downgraded entities. And the same happens vice versa, so our downgraded Angular entity can then work in AngularJS. And an important thing to know about this is that dependency injection still works, and still works between both frameworks. So you can have a downgraded Angular service, and because it's downgraded, it can be used inside AngularJS as well. But it can still work inside Angular. And the important thing is it's the same instance that's getting shared. So if your Angular list component sets some data on the service, the edit component from AngularJS will be able to read that same data. So it's shared data between both the AngularJS and Angular. So that's really useful. So the next mental model to understand is who's in control. Now, as I said before, we've got Angular and AngularJS. Both are involved in running the application. Who's in control at any given moment is really important. So let's imagine we've got this AngularJS application. This is kind of the representation of the HTML hierarchy. We've got body, the body tag, the card, the spinner. Each of those kind of nodes in our HTML and our DOM tree, it needs to belong, it needs to be controlled by either AngularJS or Angular. So for example, we can have the card entity, and that if we migrate that to Angular, then Angular is in control of that entity. But in order to use the card entity inside an AngularJS entity of body, we need to downgrade it. So at the same time, in order to use the spinner entity, the AngularJS spinner entity inside our Angular card, we would need to upgrade it. And the important thing to know is that AngularJS is always bootstrapped first and owns the bottommost view. So the root component, the root of everything, is an AngularJS component. So, or an AngularJS, or basically AngularJS. So the top of your tree of components, of entities, needs to be AngularJS or is AngularJS. You'll always have to downgrade it to get it to work. And I think a really good way, a really good mental model to think about how to migrate, or at least the way I recommend for how to migrate, is that of a plague, of a disease. So I like to think of it like we are infecting an AngularJS application with Angular. So in this case, I've infected resource with Angular. And I also recommend you start at the leaves. I also recommend that you only ever downgrade something to get it to work. Don't, very rarely, if you can, upgrade stuff to get it to work inside Angular. It's far, far better to just do it in one direction, go from the leaves up. So I would recommend starting at the leaf, which is our resource entity, rewrite that in Angular and downgrade it so it can be used. And then we just downgrade the next thing that we can work on. So then now that we can basically do service, because all of its dependencies are now Angular, let's now rewrite service as Angular. We can drop the downgrade on the resource because it's now not being used anywhere else other than Angular, but we do have to add a downgrade to our service because it is being used inside different AngularJS entities. And then we basically keep on doing that, keep on going through our application. Again, the leaves upwards is best, downgrade when we need to. And then when we go up the chain to now the list entity has been rewritten to Angular but downgraded, because remember the root of everything is AngularJS. So the root, the top level components will always have to be downgraded, no matter if you rewrite them in Angular. And again, because card and spinner is now only being used inside the list entity, and list entity is now Angular, we can drop the downgrades on those. And so then everything has been rewritten to Angular. We've had to downgrade the top level entities. So then the final thing we do is basically drop AngularJS, and then we can drop all the downgrades as well. Now everything is now running an Angular application. However, not everything is also rosy. There's a couple of things you need to deal with. Not everything can be migrated to Angular 2. Some things have to be rewritten. So for instance, filters. So AngularJS had the concept of filters. You can't migrate them, you can't upgrade them or anything like that. You have to rewrite them to pipes. But usually filters, they're really not that complex in terms of functionality. So it's not that hard to rewrite them to pipes. And some directives, those without templates, those that don't have direct, or those that can't be directly migrated to components, those will need to be rewritten as Angular directives. So that's it. That's the mental model we need to have, or you need to have in your heads before you start the process of migration. So first thing, dual booting. We need to load both AngularJS and Angular in the application at the same time. Now we do that because then we can have interoperability. We can have AngularJS entities and Angular entities living side by side in the same application. And then we have to deal with the other issue, who's in control. Each DOM node is either controlled by AngularJS or Angular. So therefore, if we want to have an Angular entity sitting under an AngularJS entity or a DOM node controlled by AngularJS, we need to downgrade it. And vice versa, when we have an AngularJS entity that needs to sit under a DOM node that's controlled by Angular, we need to upgrade it. That leads me to the final mental model, which is one I advocate, which is to deal with migration like a plague which starts at the leaves. Infect the leaves of your application and then go up it. So if you are implementing the migration with my plan, then you would really only ever be downgrading stuff, because if you're going from the leaves upwards, there's no reason to upgrade an AngularJS entity, because I find that when you've got entities where some directives are upgraded from AngularJS to Angular and some components are downgraded from Angular to AngularJS, then things start to get a little bit messy. I think it's a lot cleaner if you start from the leaves and go upwards.